Hello class. This week we're going to start a new block about fibers and textiles. Now what does that mean? Well, textiles are things like clothing. So we're going to learn about how clothing, or really how fabric, is created and where it comes from, what it's made out of. There are two basic kinds of fibers that we make fabric out of. There are fibers that come from animals, and there are fibers that come from plants. One fiber that you guys are really familiar with from handwork at Boreal Sun is wool. And of course, wool comes from sheep. And you'll be learning a lot about sheep and how farmers raise sheep in our next read aloud called Mountain Born. For now, I have a different kind of animal fiber, which I'll explain in a minute. You all got a bag like this, and I'm going to talk about that in just a minute. First, I want to talk kind of about, in general, fibers and what the process is for getting fiber from an animal or a plant into clothing. So the first step in any kind of fiber making is to grow the fiber. You either need to raise an animal, like a sheep, or you need to grow a plant, like cotton is a plant. I'm wearing a sweater that's made out of cotton, and my shirt is made out of cotton, and my pants are even made out of cotton. I think even my socks are made out of cotton. Probably you might be wearing something made out of cotton too. You can check labels on clothing. It's the little tag in the back that might tell you what your clothing is made out of. A lot of clothing is made out of cotton, which is a plant. So we'll be getting into more detail about each of the different plants and animals that we get fibers from. But the same process generally applies to all of them. So we grow the animal, we feed it and raise it, or we grow the plant, we plant the seeds, we water it, it grows. Then the next step is to harvest the fiber. So with an animal, that means cutting off the hair of the animal. Most of the time, you don't have to kill the animal to get the fiber. Sometimes, unfortunately, you do. But that's a choice that you can make to use that kind of fiber or not, if that's something that doesn't feel right to you. So most of the time though, especially if it's a hair that comes off of an animal, we collect that hair by cutting it off or shearing the animal. And it doesn't hurt them really at all. With a plant, there are different processes for different plants for getting the fiber off of the crop, but you have to harvest the crop either way. You have to basically cut it down and take it apart. Which brings me to the next step, which is to clean the fiber. So with an animal, you're going to want to wash the fiber. So you would use soapy water usually to wash a fur or hair from an animal. And from a plant, you're going to want to separate the fiber that's used for the clothing you're making from the rest of the plant. And so it depends on the type of plant how that's done. The next thing we need to do is get all the fiber ready to spin by making all the fibers go in one direction. When we're sorting the fiber on animal hair, we do something that's called carding. That's when we use two brushes to brush the fur so that it all lines up in one direction. When we do almost the same thing when we're dealing with plant fibers, but there are different tools for plant fibers to get all the fibers going in the same direction. Once we have all the fibers lined up in one direction, we can spin the fiber into yarn. Those of you who were here last year saw me do a little bit of spinning on a spinning wheel. When we spin on a spinning wheel, we're basically twisting the fiber in order to make it into yarn. And we're making it long because the fibers kind of stack on top of each other and twist together so you can have a piece of yarn as long as you want. When you're using plant fibers, you can spin them in the same way. we either use a spinning wheel or what's called a spindle to spin any kind of fiber. The last step in the process is to make fabric or cloth out of the fiber. This can either be done by knitting the yarn that you've created by spinning or by weaving the yarn. Now, most stretchy fabrics are made by knitting. So if you look at your clothes, most of you guys who know how to knit at this point know what it looks like, know what knitting looks like, especially the stockinette stitch where one side has the little V's and the other side has little bumps. And if I look at my sweater, I can see that even though it's teeny tiny, it has little V's. This is a knit sweater. It was probably knit with a machine though, because it's such small threads. Even my shirt was knit with tiny little threads of cotton. Woven fabric isn't very stretchy, and it tends to look like, let's see if I can weave my fingers, kind of like that, like a basket or something like that, something where you go under, over, under, over, under, over. So that basic process applies to all the different fibers we're going to talk about. Now we'll talk about what you have in your bag. So you have a fiber in here that looks, it's gonna look kind of familiar, but it might, it's a little different than what you're used to. This is a type of wool, but it's not from a sheep. It's from an animal named an alpaca. And everybody got some white alpaca hair and some brown alpaca hair. And I just wanted to let you each have a little bit of both colors because they're both so beautiful. I had the opportunity this summer to meet an alpaca. In fact, the very alpaca that this white wool came from. This alpaca lives in Anchorage, and it is the pet of my cousin's boyfriend, whose name is Steve. And Steve let us come to his house in Anchorage and meet his alpaca. It was a very nice alpaca, but a little bit shy, as alpaca tend to be, and sometimes it would spit at us, which wasn't very fun. Now, alpaca wool tends to be softer than sheep wool and a little less allergenic. That means that some people, like me, who are allergic to sheep wool, might do better with alpaca wool instead. So if you tend to have a hard time wearing wool, you could try alpaca instead. We are going to wash our wool, and I'll show you that in another video. The wool, the little container that's in there with your wool, it looks empty, but it's not. There's a tiny little bit of soap in here, and I'll show you how to use it to wash your alpaca wool.